intro just to tell you who I am. My name is Doug Barron. I'm the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. You can find out more about me, what it is that I do, right there at FullMontyLeadership.com. Check us out. I really appreciate you coming over, and of course you can find my blog there, and you can find the links to our podcast, to the fact that I'm on YouTube, I have a big channel on there, and that I write for Entrepreneur Magazine, Medium, Thrive Global, which is Ariana Huffington's outlet, and a bunch of other great outlets. So if you want to find out more about me, there's all kinds of ways. Just Google Dov Baron, D-O-V-B-A-R-O-N, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. Okay? So I look forward to you searching that stuff out. Okay, so let's jump in. Right at the very beginning, I mean, by the way, that's not my name. I took a photograph every time I get Starbucks because inevitably they spell my name wrong. So let's start at the beginning. What is the beginning? Well, the beginning is the same beginning for all of us. You were born. I was born. You enter into the world, and I'm not sure what the circumstances are of anybody's birth. I mean, we get to find out those kinds of things from people. They tell us, but they're secondhand news. I mean, we don't have the brain capacity. The brain is not fully developed enough for us to actually know what the circumstances of our own birth are, or certainly even to fully remember what they are. So we rely on somebody telling us, oh yeah, your mother was in labor for 8 hours, or whatever it might be. But we come into this world, and we come into this world with a certain level of naivety. Let's just call it naivety. Some would say it's a blank slate. I would disagree with that. I used to think that, I really did, until I understood neurology, and I started to understand quantum resonance fields, particularly as they pertain to morphogenetic fields and fields of consciousness that we fall into and how we're impacted by those. It's a fabulous, fantastic study that I've been involved in for more than 30 years, and I just love it because it really takes away this idea of coincidence, which will tie in perfectly to what we're talking about the stories today, that there is no coincidence, but there is in fact resonance, and that certain things are resonated into our lives, or not, or not, depending on the stories we tell ourselves. So in the beginning I was born, and I was, you know, like probably all kids, I came into the world feeling like, wow, you know, here I am. I don't know that, I'm making that up. But I remember as an adult doing some work on myself, working with a therapist. Probably I was in my mid-20s, and at that time that therapist was asking me about the kinds of things that irritated me. What was it that bugged me? You know, and I was trying to be, I will be honest with you, I was trying to be a bit evasive and not really dig into it because it was kind of scary for me. I was in my early 20s. I didn't really want to look too deeply into those kinds of things. I might find shit that I needed to deal with, which of course I had lots of. However, she pushed, and then she said, well, just give me an example of something that irritates you. And I said, well, I find myself really irritated by whiny kids. You know, when you're out and there's that kid that's just whiny and they're clingy to their mother and whiny to their mother. And that was those kinds of kids just used to irritate the crap out of me. I just had no patience for them. And so this lady, this therapist, said to me, I wonder how that's you. What do you mean, you wonder how that's me? I'm whiny? I don't think so. Nothing whiny about me. Wasn't having any of that. So she said, well, why don't you find out what you were like as a kid? And that's exactly what I did. I actually asked my mom what I was like in the first sort of 5 years of my life. And what I found out was that I was an incredibly shy kid. Now, my wife still has a great deal of challenge believing that I am a shy person. Actually, shyness is my natural state. I've trained myself away from it. I look like I'm gregarious, I look like I'm an extrovert, but I'm actually more of an introvert naturally. And I tend to be quite shy in an environment.
Like saying the opposite of stuff, and my friend was just like,
it's not easy for me, even though it looks very easy and people think it's easy, it's actually not. So I was this very shy kid. And as such, when somebody would knock at the front door, I would hide behind my mom's leg. I would, you know, that kid that clings to their mom's leg, and I would kind of peek around through my mom's leg and hide because I was so insecure and I was so shy. And now, and maybe a few years after I had this realization, I came to realize how beautiful that was, how wonderful, how much of a gift that was, that I was this shy kid. Because in that naivety, I was remaining fully, completely and totally a kid, a child, seeing the world that way, seeing the world as a child. It was beautiful. And then at 7 years old, when I was 7, I came down the stairs one day into this narrow hallway that went out towards the street, and it was the summertime, and as I looked out of this hallway, which was dark and the light was coming flooding in, the silhouette of a man was walking away, and of course it was my father. And I called out and said, "Dad, where are you going?" 7 years old. And my father turned on his heels and walked back towards me and crouched down. So he was as close to the same height as I was as a 7-year-old boy. And he crouched down and he put his hand on my shoulder and then took his other hand and sort of ruffled my hair and then put his other hand on my other shoulder and said, with this sort of fake smile, "I'm going now, son. You're the man of the house." 7 years old. 7 years old. My father just knighted me as the man of the house. That was it. That was my lot. That was the end of naivety. That was childhood stripped away, removed in that one instant. And my father turned on his heels, walked away, and his silhouette passed out of the door, and that was the last we saw of him. I mean, I did see him later on in life, but that was the last time he would be, quote unquote, my father. So I found myself really missing having a dad. I lost my dad. I became a fatherless child. But what's more is I didn't only become a fatherless child, I became the man of the house. That was the instruction. I was now the man of the house to my mother, who was deeply depressed and really sort of dragging herself through her life, and it was very difficult because now she was needing to provide for the entire family. My siblings didn't know what was going on, so I was now responsible for being the older sibling, and I became this very doing kid. I became this kid who learned very quickly how to do things, how to adapt, how to get things done, and I became very productive. I became a real doer, a real go-getter, and that was the kind of person that I was as a little child. By the time I was 7, 8 years old, I was cleaning the house because my mom was working 2, 3 jobs. I would clean the house, I would prepare meals, I would get my siblings ready when they came home from school and get them stripped down and ready for bed. I would do all of those things. I learned how to do those things, but there was you should know there was another side to that, and because when I would do those things, my mom would say, "What a good boy you are, aren't you a good boy?" And I would get her love and affection, and I really wanted that. That level of importance to my mom was vital to me. I wanted that. It made me feel like life was going to be okay, and so I did that. On top of that, if you would have asked my mom about me back at that time, she would have said, "Oh, Dov makes me laugh, he makes me smile, I can talk to him," and she would cry with me, and so I became her counselor as well. So I learned how to do those things at a very, very young age. At a very, very young age. But that kind of a situation doesn't set you up well for life. And I always had that craving, the same craving I had with my mom to get my mom's love and affection, and even my dad's, who was gone. The desire to have that affection didn't go away. Now, as a kid, I had this passion, true passion for art. I wanted to be an artist more than anything. In fact, by the time I was, I think, 10 or 11, my art was in a gallery. It was doing pretty great. I was highly recognized. I had teachers who would keep my scribblings because they said one day you're going to be famous and this is going to be worth a lot of money, and they wanted to keep my art. So it was pretty great, and I just loved it. And art, in truth, was my escape when things were just crazy at home. My stepfather and I absolutely hated each other, and that's not an understatement. Or an overstatement for that matter. That was how we literally felt about each other. It changed as we got older, but at the beginning, for many years, we just hated each other. And so it was very difficult. And so part of my escape, I had two escapes. One was to get on my bike and pedal like a lunatic until my legs felt like they were going to burst. And that was when I knew I was far enough away from the craziness. But that focus on the cycling, that pressure on my legs would actually pull me away from the stress and the tension of whatever was going on in my family. My other escape was art, that I would do art, that I would sneak into the basement and use actually house paints, and I would paint and I would draw and I would sculpt and I'd do all these things. I was passionate about it. I was totally, completely passionate about art. I felt like it was in my blood. I loved seeing paintings by Rembrandt and later on by Dali, who became my favorite artist, and all these other artists. I ate, slept, breathed, loved art. And at 14 years old, I got in front of this, what were they called? Career counselor. That's what they had in those days. They were called career counselors. What they were people who were probably poorly trained, so I forgive them. But this career counselor asked me, who do you want to be, or what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, what do you think my answer was? Well, I want to be an artist. And this career counselor said to me, yeah, that's nice. 1 in 100 make it, and 1 in 100 of those make any money at it. You need to find another career. Now, I was devastated because at that time I was severely dyslexic, didn't know, couldn't read very well, spelt even worse, really struggled academically, and I thought, if I can't be an artist, what am I going to do? And I went home and I cried. I mean, I was weeping to my mom, and my mom said, there's other ways to be an artist. There is? Like what? And she said, well, I have a friend, and she had this person that she knew, she said, who owned a hair salon. And she said, maybe you could do that. Doing hair might be an artistic way for you to be. So, at that 13, 14 years old, I went, I was almost 14, I was 13 years old, I went to meet with this guy who actually ended up having one of the most famous hair salons in Manchester, the city that was closest to where I was from. And I spoke with him and got a Saturday job washing hair, and then shortly after lied about my age, because nobody knew. I had facial hair pretty early on, so I lied about my age. Back in those days, you finished school at 16, so I sort of said I was 16, and I ended up doing a 4-year apprenticeship in 10 months. So I gained all this, I lost this dream of being an artist, and I gained this new way of being an artist. It was wonderful, it was exciting, and I was passionate about hair. Because again, it was this artistic outlet. I was being so passionate about it. In fact, when people would meet me, they would, for many years, they would say to me, please stop talking to my hair. Because I actually wouldn't look them in the eye, I would look them in the hair. I'm like, I'd be thinking about their hair and what I could do with it. I was just nuts about it. And that actually stayed with me for about 10 years, about 9 years. I was quite passionate about it, even though I was in that industry for 13. The last 4 of those, I was pretty bored out of my mind. But that's a whole other story we can get into at another time. However, so I'm passionate about hair. I've done this 4-year apprenticeship in 10 months. So I'm right in there. And at 15-ish, I decided I'm going to start my own business. I'm very entrepreneurial at a very early age, and I want to start my own business. So that's exactly what I do. I start my own business. Start my own hairdressing business. Now, I didn't have any money to buy a salon or anything crazy like that, but what I decided to be was what's called a mobile hairdresser. And what that meant was I had a bicycle, and I would get on my bike and I would cycle out to see people, and I would cut their hair and perm their hair and color their hair in their homes. So I would do it all right in their own homes. And I remember this one occasion, one evening, pedaling home in the summertime, sweating, and it was like late at night, like 10, 11 o'clock at night, and I'm pedaling home and I'm so freaking excited and the sweat's pouring off me, and because my pockets are full of crumpled up pound notes, and I made like 400 pounds in that afternoon and evening. I mean, that would be like making $2,000 today in an evening. It was pretty spectacular, and I was like, wow, this is fabulous. That was what I wanted to do, so I was doing really great. At 15, so now at 15 years old, you know, so I started this business at 15 years old. It's just at that point where I was transitioning out of one and into the out of one thing into the other, as in working in the salon, starting my own business. I met Carmel Claffey. Carmel Claffey. I can't remember actually where I met her, but I think I was in a bar. Yes, I was underage in a bar. I know, it's terrible. It was the UK, and everybody did that. So I'm in this bar with somebody, I can't remember who I was with, and I saw this girl walking, and she was gorgeous. She was stunning, and I don't know where I got the balls from, but I got the balls from to go and say hello to her. And I began to speak to her, and she was, I think she was a couple of years older than me, and I spoke to her, and I must have been drinking or something, but I had the courage to ask her out, and she said yes. Oh my God. I mean, this was like dream come true. I found out she was a model, and you know, this was like amazing for me. I was this kid from the wrong side of the tracks, from the poorest part of the city, and she was actually from a really nice area. Her father had his own business. It was just, she was another world. She, you know, I felt like I was a 3 and she was a 10. Not just in the way that she looked and the way that I looked, because I definitely did not feel attractive. But not only that, in this lifestyle, in this wealth, and and she invited me to her home, and I spent time with her family, and I went to her sister's wedding and actually did the hair for the wedding, and she was a lovely girl, and she was very kind, and she was very caring, and she was very loving, and her family were also very kind and caring and loving, and I was besotted. I fell madly, deeply, head over heels in love with her, and I'm 15 years old, and I want to ask her to marry me. And I'm looking for evidence of people who got married young, and you know, and why it's okay. And so I decided that that's what I was going to do. And just as I was sort of thinking about those kinds of things, I would talk to her a little bit about it, and you know, she would be saying, well, you know, don't you think we're kind of young for making that kind of commitment? And she was never harsh about it, never said you're crazy or any of those kinds of things. But you know, she clearly had a little more brains than I did, and she had a good deal more maturity than I did. And so she said, she dumped me. She dumped me. I mean, I'm sure she did it in a very kind way, in a compassionate way, but she dumped me. And my mother tells me that I spent 3 days in my bedroom weeping. I mean, I cried and cried and cried that this girl had broken my heart. And I remember so clearly, making a commitment, making a decision that I would never be that hurt again. I would never allow myself to be that hurt again. It just wasn't going to happen. I was never going to let it happen. I decided that if I was going to date anybody, she was going to love me more than I loved her. She was going to like me more than I liked her. And that way I would be able to protect my heart. That way I would never get hurt in that way. It would never happen to me. You may be able to relate to this. So I had lost the love of my life, and I was in great loss. And therefore I gained this commitment to myself to never get hurt like that again. And then I met, you know, I had met some other people, one of whom I'm actually, one of my only girlfriends I'm still friends with in a subtle way is actually here on Facebook, and she's a lovely lady. I met her, dated her for a little while when we were kids. And then I met Chris. And Chris was from my hometown. She grew up in the same mentality as I did. She grew up in the same thinking that I did. And for people where we were from, you know, you needed to be married before you were 20. If you were 22 and getting married, you were an old maid, and if you were a girl. So just like, so we started dating within, I don't know, within like a month. She was like, well, when are we going to get engaged? And she was pushing hard, and she was clearly crazy about me. I mean, she would brag about me. She was excited about the fact that I was entrepreneurial. She was excited about the fact that I had my own business. She was excited about that I wanted to have multiple businesses. I was telling her that I wanted to travel because I was already studying the things that I wanted to study. Now I started getting engaged in the metaphysical studies and the psychological studies, and so I talk about these things. Nobody spoke like that where I was from. It just didn't even happen. So she was very enthralled with this personality who was driven, who was businesslike, who was entrepreneurial, who was wanting to learn, who was getting out there, who was going to travel the world and do all those kinds of things. So she became very excited about me, and the fact that back in those days, a very long time ago, back in those days when I was 16 years old, I looked like David Cassidy in those days. I looked like David Cassidy. You remember that show, the 70s show with Kelso? You know, he had the David Cassidy hair. That's kind of how I looked back in those days. Things have changed a little. So she, you know, she would rave about how I looked like David Cassidy, and so she was besotted, and she'd put pressure on all the time, until eventually I said, okay, let's get engaged. And I went out and bought this ring, and really I bought the ring just to shut her up. But, you know, the problem with agreeing to get engaged is the immediate question after getting engaged is what? You can guess it. When are you going to get married? So at 16 years old, in November, I got married. Now, that wasn't an easy process because you can't get married without legal consent from a parent at that age. You cannot get married without legal consent of a parent at 16 years old. It just doesn't happen. So my dad was gone, so I asked my mom. And of course my mom said, are you crazy? Absolutely not. Well, remember I told you about how my father had left and I'd instantly grown up? What that meant was I had already at 7 created this mindset that you don't tell me what to do, I'm going to go ahead and do it. So I had this rebellious streak in me that was so fierce that I said to my mother, oh really? Okay. I took my mom to court. The judge was Judge Leslie Walsh, still remember to this day. Judge Leslie Walsh, he was a famous judge. He was one of the most harsh judges in the city, in the ghetto town of where I was from. In fact, I think he had put both my father and my stepdad in the jail for at least overnight at some point in time, right? So I stood in front of him and he asked me, you know, what I want to do, and I was talking to him and I gave my case, if you will. And my dad said, and the judge said, you are the most articulate, intelligent 16-year-old I've ever met. And if you're stupid enough to get married, who am I to stand in your way? And he rubber stamped, and off we went, and we got married in November at age 16. Chris was much older than me, she was 17. So we got married. So I gained a wife. I gained rebellion. I gained a fuck you to my mother. I gained all that stuff. And I got in there, and I was married. And I will tell you with absolute certainty that I wanted that to work. I wanted it to be a good marriage. I wanted us to work. And I was speaking just last weekend down in Napa, California, and speaking about the fact that I'm married and I've been with my wife for 20 years. And, you know, one of the guys said, you know, I'm kind of sick of this story of your fantastic marriage. Is there any other examples? And I told this story about how I had married Chris and how it had fallen apart. And I said, do you know why it fell apart? And of course the answer is always the same, because you guys were young. No, it didn't fall apart because we were young. It fell apart because we did what everybody else did. If we'd have been 26, 36, 46 and got married and followed the system that we were in, we'd have probably ended up divorced, and we did. We ended up divorced 5 years later. Now, 3 years after we got married, my daughter was born, Caprice, and I was never really, I didn't know how to be a dad, and I felt quite jealous of her when she was born. I felt like she got all the love and all the attention, and I really wanted it. I was still a kid. I still needed all that love and attention. I still needed to be recognized. I still needed to be validated, and felt sort of gypped. And I will be honest that I kind of resented that. I did. I resented that. But I was willing to stay in, I was willing to stay focused, I still wanted to make it work. And I remember, because remember I had said, even when we had met, I had told Chris, listen, I want to travel the world and I want to study and I want to work abroad and all those kinds of things that she thought was great at the time. But as we got, we've been married a couple of years, I started to find jobs. And remember, I was still hairdressing, so I found a job in Florida. Well, that wasn't going to happen. No. I mean, it wasn't just for me, it was for all of us. I found a job in Bermuda. That wasn't going to happen. She wanted to stay close to her family. I found a job that was 2 towns away. That wasn't going to happen because she couldn't keep her eye on me. So, I mean, she was a kid. It wasn't, she wasn't doing anything weird. It was just, we were kids. Anyway, at 21, that came to an end. So now I lost a marriage. And of course, I lost being a parent. And there was a part of me that sort of felt like it was freeing, but also a part of me that felt incredibly guilty, incredibly ashamed. But I went on from there and did begin to travel and go around the world and do all these different things and study with all these different teachers and did amazing things. And actually ended up having businesses that I ran in the UK, then in Canada, in East Coast Canada, and then there's way more stories into this, but then I moved to Australia and had salons there and had businesses there. But after about 10 years, as I said, in the hairdressing world, I was bored out of my mind. We had the top 5 salons in Australia, things were really great, but I honestly was so bored and was deeply entrenched in my studies around metaphysics, philosophy, psychology, and all those kinds of things, and really was engrossed in all that. And one day, one of my clients, Steve, came in, and we would always have these great conversations, have these fabulous, in-depth, philosophical, metaphysical, psychological conversations. And one day, Steve says to me, he says, I want you to come and speak to my board of directors. I want you to come and speak to my managers. That's what it was, my managers. Now, Steve owned a national menswear company. I was like, you want me to talk to your people? Why? And he said, I just want you to. Okay, about what? Anything you like, he says. You can speak about anything you like. I don't think so, mate. I'm not the speaker. I've never done that kind of stuff. This is a bit weird for me. What are you talking about? He said, I want you to come speak. And I said, well, for how long? And he goes, I'll give you an hour. You can speak for an hour. I'm like, an hour? Are you crazy? I can't speak for an hour. Now an hour's not even a warm-up. But, I want you to speak for an hour. And I said, I can't do that. And he goes, okay, do 30 minutes. And I said, all right, I'll do 30 minutes. And he said, but I have one condition. I'm thinking, okay, here it is. He goes, here's the condition. You've got to show up looking exactly like this. Now, this is 1984. In 1984, I'm in my early 20s. 83, 84, I think it was like 24 years old. I'm in my early 20s, and I've been a bodybuilder since I was 19. So, when you're in your early 20s and you're a bodybuilder, you tend to want to show that off. Well, let me rephrase that. That's not fair. I wanted to show that off. Now my wife says, why don't you take your shirt off? It's hot. No. I don't bodybuild for others. But back then, it was part of my thing, wear shirts that are too tight. And back in those days, my hair was down here. It was like way down on my chest, and tight ringlet curls. And I had the designer stubble, and I had earrings that you could swing parrots off. Which, now my hair used to be in a ponytail all the time. It was slicked back, but on this particular day I had ripped jeans on, a skin-tight t-shirt, and my hair was out wild. And Steve said, the condition is this. Here's the condition. You got to show up looking exactly like this. I'm like, what are you talking about? Why do you want me to show up looking like this? I've got suits. You make my suits. He goes, I know, but I don't want you to show up in a suit. I want you to show up looking like this. And I'm like, okay, but, can't put my hair in a ponytail, right? He goes, no, I want you to show up exactly like this. So I've got this wild, crazy hair, I've got the ripped jeans on the tight t-shirt, and I show up for the gig. Now, as instructed, I stick my head in the door, and I can see all the guys sitting around this very long board table. Steve's up front, and they're all buttoned up tight in their 80s suits with the ties and all the stuff. And I've got my head in the door, and you can see these guys looking at me, giving me the bugger off nod. Like, you know, as if to say, get out, what are you doing in here? You're in the wrong place. So, but I, you know, I knew what I was supposed to be, so I stayed there and I was doing just that. I was just waiting. And then Steve said, please welcome our guest speaker, Dom. And I walked up and, you know, jaws onto the desk. You know, people are like, what the hell is this? And wondering what's going on. And I go up, and I will tell you clearly, I do not remember what I spoke about. I only remember my opening. I remember clearly what I said at the opening. And I remember how I felt after I'd said it. So, at the opening, I stood at the end of this table and I looked down at these guys, and I said it was the 80s. Racism was a big issue in Australia because of the Aboriginal people. And I said, put your hand up if you're a racist. And can you imagine? Nobody puts their hand up, of course. Nobody's going to admit that. I said, okay. So put your hand up if you would judge somebody by the color of their skin, by the clothing that they wear, by how they look in any way, shape, or form. And of course, again, nobody puts up their hand. And I just smiled at him and said, you're a bunch of freaking liars. Now at this point, I look over at Steve, and I'm thinking, you know, I might be dead in the water here. And Steve's just got this big smile on his face. And I said, you're a bunch of liars. Every single one of you judged me. Every one of you decided who I was, the amount of money that I have, whether I was a customer, whether I was a waste of your time when I stood in that doorway and you were giving me that get out of here look. Every one of you had made an assessment about me, but you all were wrong. Because I actually am your customer. That's originally how I met Steve. He used to make my suits. So I got plenty of suits that I bought from your company. But if I'd have walked in there that day dressed like this, you would have said that I'm not a customer. You would have dismissed me. You would have missed out on business. And I look over at Steve, and again, he looks like he's got this big Cheshire cat smile. Now, I don't remember anything else I said, I really don't, but I do remember that. So I gained this position again. Now I'm, oh my God, I found my authentic voice. The problem is I don't know that. I mean, what I spoke about was a demonstration of that, but I don't get it. Have you ever had that experience where there's a lesson that you give and it's actually for you? Oh my goodness, I didn't get it. I didn't get it at all. About 2 weeks later, Steve comes in, we're chatting, and he says, you know, he's telling me how great it went, how happy he was, and he says, listen, I spoke to a friend of mine, and they'd love you to come speak to their group. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah. And he goes, you know, you can do your half an hour again. And I go, same stuff? He goes, no, you can do whatever you want again. Really? Okay, fantastic. Guess what I did? You'd never guess. Brutal mistake. I began to research speakers. I began to research motivational speakers in the 80s. Zig Ziglar, Dennis Waitley, you know, all the guys you can imagine were there. Jim Rohn. I began to research all those guys, and what did I see? I saw guys with short hair. I saw guys in blue suits, white shirts, and red ties. You know, I saw all these guys. So I, in my genius, and I really do say that with tongue in cheek, in my genius way said, oh, okay, that must be what a speaker looks like. So what did I do? I cut off my hair. I grew in my mustache, nasty, nasty caterpillar mustache, and had this short hair, and not even short and stubby, I mean short and knobby. I mean, I looked like a car salesman, a bad car salesman. Bought myself a tight blue suit, wore the white shirt and the red tie. In fact, many, many years later, somebody actually brought me a photograph of that, and it was like 20 years later, and I actually looked older in the picture than I did 20 years later. So I had gotten the speaking gig, I gained that. I gained this natural, authentic positioning of myself in what I delivered. And what did I do? I went to look for what's wrong with me. I went to look for what was missing, and I completely gave away my authenticity and started to look like everybody else. Now, as you can imagine, it didn't go down very well. And my speaking career kind of struggled quite a bit from there on. It became quite challenging. Now, by the time 1988 came along, I made the decision that I was going to move to Canada. There's a whole other big story in there, but I moved to Canada, and I actually couldn't believe it when I came through. I remember arriving on Burrard Street, walking down Burrard Street in Vancouver towards, and it goes massively downhill, and in the distance is the mountains, and it's a blue sky. It was August the 8th, 1988. It was just gorgeous. It was absolutely beautiful. And I gained this new beginning. I was very excited about having this new beginning. It was going to be phenomenal. But it didn't take long before I started to feel like there's something missing again. There's something missing. And I didn't know what it was. And then in June 1990, as some of you know, I became very successful as a speaker. I mean, I was having success in the way that I dreamed about success, which was, you know, I had a nice car, I had a nice house, I had plenty of money in the bank, I had lots of people waiting to meet with me and speaking gigs. It was wonderful. But I was pretty exhausted, and I came back after a speaking tour, and the person who was my manager said to me, I booked you 4 days off, and so that you can go and get some rest and recreation. And I went up to Whistler, which is in British Columbia here, a place where you might know the Winter Olympics were. And it was a gorgeous day. In the morning we spent by the lake, and in the afternoon we went to a place called Brandywine Falls, which is this majestic waterfalls that falls 200 feet of glacial waterfalls off the edge of the cliff. It's just beautiful. And we sort of hiked down there for about 45 minutes, and being an adrenaline junkie as I was, I said to my buddy, let's see if we can get behind the waterfall. He's like, what, are you crazy? So we scrambled across these wet, mossy rocks with the spray coming off there at 70 miles an hour. And we got to that place where we were, you know, like right behind the waterfall with like a, I don't know, it's like 3 feet, I think, in front of us. And if you put your arm out, it would literally knock your arm off. There was tons and tons of water. When I came out of there, I was so freaking exhilarated and so excited. And of course, being an adrenaline junkie, you know, and now filled with adrenaline from the being behind the waterfall, I challenged my buddy again. I said, let's not hike, let's free climb. He's like, what are you talking about? Let's climb the cliff. Now, mountain climbing, for most people is a bit crazy, but it's not. If you've got the ropes and you've got all the stuff, it's fine. You've got safety lines, all kinds of stuff. Free climbing, a little crazier because you don't have those things, but you have the right shoes, you have the right clothing, and you have chalk, you have a lot of things that can keep you safe, but it's certainly a lot crazier. If you want to take free climbing to a whole other level of crazy, then free climb in soaking wet clothes with soaking wet shoes and no chalk, that's what we began to do. And at about 120 feet, which is, in case you're wondering what that is, it's about 12 stories. So if you imagine being in a high-rise building, going out to the balcony on that high-rise building and imagining that there's no railing and you look over the edge, that's what 120 feet looks like. And at about 120 feet, I reached for a rock. I dislodged a bigger rock that hit me in the face, knocked me unconscious and sent me hurtling down to the bottom where I got smashed to absolute pieces. When I came around, I felt like my head was underwater because it was filled with fluid. It wasn't until I tasted that sense of rusty metal that I realized it was blood. There's a whole big story in there of the recovery, which you can imagine was brutal and long. So right there, all that success was immediately taken away in a flash, in a moment. Everything that I knew about who I was, about the success that I had, all of it was suddenly gone. And the recovery, as I said, was very long and very hard. The recovery at a physical level was actually much easier than it was at a mental or emotional level. And I definitely felt like I had lost everything. So again, There's a great deal of black in that place, feeling like everything is gone. About 9 months later, I found myself on my living room floor in a fetal position, weeping, feeling completely destroyed, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, broke in every possible way, and just didn't know how to come back. And it was at that point that I realized there was no back, and that I had to move forward. But what that would mean was that I couldn't stay where I was, which was feeling like a victim, and I'd lost everything. I'd have to move forward, but I knew I couldn't move forward in the way that I had before. I'd have to do something else. I'd have to be different. And it was at that point that I began to really look at the meaning of my life, why I was doing what I was doing. What was the common thread? What was this theme that ran through everything that I did? What was it? Because I had come in 1988 to Vancouver, but my plan was to leave. 3 years later, I moved to LA. Well, clearly that was not going to happen, because 1990 is when the fall happened. So I really had to dig in and begin to consider what my purpose was. Why was I here on the planet? I felt like I was on purpose. I felt like I was on target. Was I passionate? Yes. Was I passionate about hairdressing back in the day? Yes. And so I made this mistake that so many people make, in that I thought that my passion was my purpose. Your passion is not your purpose. Your passion contains your purpose. Your passion is a vehicle for your purpose, but the two things are dramatically different. Because if you want to think about it, and I gave you examples, when I was a kid, I was passionate about art. Now I barely paint, barely sketch. So does that mean that I wasn't passionate about it? No, of course I was passionate about it, but it wasn't my purpose. We confuse passion and purpose. Think about the things that you were passionate about in your early teens or in your early 20s, or maybe even in your 40s, that maybe you're not passionate about anymore. Does that mean you've lost your purpose? No, it means that your passion is burned out. It can burn out with that thing. But your purpose is deeper than the passion. It's actually a thread that runs through that. It's the thing that actually runs through the passions that you have in any given moment. Now, there's way more stories I can tell you, way more I can go into here, but within all those stories is another 100 stories that I'm not going to get into. But I want to flip back for a moment. Let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning and just touch on each of these stories. I'm born into naivety. When at 7 years old, my father goes away. I lose having a father. But what did I gain? See, my father, and I'll pull no punches on this, my father, not a great human being, and that's quite the understatement. Really treated not only me, but most people very, very poorly, quite narcissistic and very destructive in his behaviors over the years. Thank goodness for my father. Really. If he hadn't have been such an ass, I would not be the man I am today. Part of what drove me to make the difference that I make, to be the person that I am, is driven by my having that boundary, that guardrail on the side that I don't want to ever bump into, of being that guy. I don't want to be like him. In fact, I'm probably a little hyper-vigilant about being that way. If anything I do that makes me feel like I might be going in that direction, I'm like veering right away from that immediately. So my father leaving me became the blessing, but it felt like a curse. There was a loss in the initial event, but the gain was it became a guardrail for how I was going to live. It became the guardrail for how I was going to be. So the loss of my father became the gain of the guardrail of who I wanted to be as a man. When I fell in love with Carmen, my first love, that was devastating. There was the loss of the love, but and with it came this horrible promise that I was never going to be able to love in that way again. I was never going to be able to open up in that way again. And as a result, it made me horrible, really horrible at relationships. I was terrible at relationships for years and years and years. I mean, I would be in them, I would be non-committal, I would treat people poorly. I was definitely shit at relationships. But you know, but what that gave me was, it gave me a point where I reached a point where I went, you know what, Dove, you are the common denominator in all your relationships. You're the thing that sucks in your relationships. It can't be that you just keep meeting terrible people. It must be you. And I began to examine myself, and I began to look at what I was doing inside the relationships. And more, I began to examine the model of relationship that I'd grown up with, that was surrounding me at every possible turn. And what did I gain? I gained this knowledge of examining what really makes a relationship work. And that the people who make it aren't lucky. There's a certain thing, because the divorce rate is a lie, because it's false. The numbers say about 50%. That's a false number, because it doesn't include people who've been married more than once. The numbers keep going up, and it certainly doesn't include people who lived together but never got married, and it most certainly doesn't include people who are emotionally, mentally divorced from each other. They're physically still married, but they're in an emotional divorce. It doesn't include any of those. So what it didn't take me long to realize was that the divorce rate is actually closer to about 97%. So what do those 3% do? I wanted to know, and that's what I began to research and understand and really grasp, and we began to craft a completely new model for relationship. But through the beginning of that work and really getting to that, I had to get really clear about what it was that I wanted in a partner. And I, as a result, got to meet my wife, the woman I've been with for 20 years, the greatest blessing of my life. But again, I wouldn't have had her if Carmen Claffey hadn't have dumped me. If I hadn't have made that shitty promise, if I hadn't have got married at 16 years old, if I hadn't have done those things, if I hadn't have been terrible at relationships, I don't know that I would have had enough pain to say, okay, it's about me, I gotta look at me, I gotta look at that, and I gotta look at the model. So all those things became the gift. I gained the gift of that self-reflection that made me look at what relationship actually had to be for me. What was going to make it truly work for me? What would I need to do? So it became an enormous gift rather than a pain. And then, of course, I lost being the artist in the form that it was in, you know, and I gained, of course, the artistic outlet in hairdressing. But I even lost that because I lost that passion. So is it a loss? Well, I spoke recently to a bunch of high school kids who were part of this, what do you call it, a startup training. It was a school where teaching kids to be entrepreneurs and do startups. And I was telling some of the kids there, like, don't let other people define you. And whatever you're passionate about right now, that's great, be passionate about it, but understand that that doesn't define the rest of your life. You may come into other things. And I was telling them about being an artist, and one of the kids said to me, well, don't you miss art? And the truth is, I don't. If I missed it, I'd think about it a lot. I don't. I mean, I appreciate art, but I don't miss being the artist. And this kid, smart kid, says to me, why do you think you don't miss being an artist? And I had to take pause. I had to think for a moment. I couldn't just puke out the right answer. And then suddenly it came to me. And I said, I heard a story once, I don't know if it's true. The story is this, that somebody had asked Michelangelo how he'd been able to carve David from the marble. The beautiful statue of David in Florence. And Michelangelo said, I didn't. My job was not to create David. My job was to chip away everything that was not David. David was always in there. And I realized I'm still an artist. It's what I do with people. I don't fix people because they're not broken. In fact, in many ways, I don't add much. What I really do is chip away everything else. And chip away all the stuff that you've gathered in your life because you didn't feel like you were enough. I chip all that away to reveal the truth of who you are, the magnificence of who you are, which has never gone away. It was always there. That's what I do. You see, because remember I spoke about right at the beginning there was a day when you were born, and you were born through whatever means and however it was you came into the world, but you came into the world, and on that particular day, somebody held you in their hand, and somebody looked at you and said, you are a miracle. They held you in their hand. That moment of looking at you. Now, I don't know if it was your mom, or if it was your dad, or it was your grandparent, or if it was a nurse. I don't know what it was. But somebody, if they didn't say those words to you, which is that you are a miracle, they certainly felt that way about you, that you were this miraculous being, and you were in their arm, and you were the length of their arm, and they held your tiny head, and they looked at your little eyes, and they said, or thought, you are a miracle. You're miraculous. You see, in that moment, when you're born, what are you missing? Absolutely nothing. There's nothing missing. You're already complete. But like me, like you, life happens to us, and when it does, we start to think that there's something missing in us. So we start accumulating. We accumulate stuff. Like I accumulated the car and the big house and all the things that I accumulated before I fell. And then we go, okay, well, you know, maybe that's not very satisfying, and I'm feeling kind of empty, and I've got $1 million, but I feel miserable. Hey, the suicide rate of the wealthy is higher than it is of the poor. So it's not going to make you happy. And so you figure, okay, well, I've got to be a better human being, so I'm going to work on that. And so I'll add things to my character. I'll be a better leader. I'll be a better this. I'll be more compassionate. You're looking to add things to you. And then you end up in this obnoxious recycling of becoming the workshop junkie. Always looking for that one magic bullet that's going to make you whole and complete. You're already there. Remember that baby. You were always whole. You were always complete. There was nothing ever missing from you. That's my job, is to remind you of that. Every one of those stories that is your life, and I don't know what your stories are, but if you lay them out and you look at them, there's a good chance each one of them happened that you went, oh, there's something missing, and you went out, if you in any kind of a self-growth, you went out and you went to go, what do I need to pursue? What do I need to get in order to feel whole? Remember I told you I was this dyslexic kid who felt like I wasn't academic. I went and got a PhD that I don't use. That I actually took off everything that I do. I don't allow people to call me by that. Because it's just another thing. It's not who I am. It's just another thing. Who cares? You're already whole. You're already complete. There is nothing missing from you. If you want to find your life purpose, it isn't by adding something to you. It's about looking at what you need to take away. Because you're already whole. You're already magnificent. I've probably got another 1,000 stories I could share with you. But those are the stories I wanted to share with you today. To show you that you can find your purpose. Not by adding things to you. Actually by stripping things away. You're already magnificent. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about your own magnificence. Because you are already complete. My name is Dov Baron. I'm the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. And I'm going to stay right here for a few minutes because I know there's still some of you who are on here